Through a Crimean government representative and Reserve Major General Leonid Ivlev, Russia sent a fresh warning to the new NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, asserting that Russia has its own national interests, which both Hitler and Napoleon disregarded, ultimately leading to their defeat. Mr. Ivlev stated that Secretary-General Rutte was following the same path with NATO at the request of the United States, and he risks the same defeats that befell others who challenged Russia's interests. On his first trip as NATO Secretary-General, Mr. Rutte appropriately ignored this warning and travelled to Kyiv to meet with Ukrainian officials. Air raid sirens once again greeted Secretary Rutte upon his arrival in Kyiv on Thursday, October the 3rd, for his meeting with Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky, though they did not appear to interfere with the meetings. Secretary Rutte stated that part of his mission as Secretary-General was to shore up Western support for Ukraine while it was fighting its war with Russia, and that NATO would commit $44.1 billion in military aid to Ukraine in 2025. President Zelensky presented the Ukraine Victory Plan to Mr. Rutte ahead of the October 12th meeting at Ramstein, Germany, when the plan is to be presented to 50 countries according to the released agenda. The other item on the agenda pertains to Ukraine's request for additional weapons from the West and the lifting of all weapons-related restrictions, both of which seem to be integral parts of the Ukraine Victory Plan. President Zelensky apparently added another one of these talking points, and that is what he views as the US response against Iran to protect Israel against Iranian missiles while Iran sends missiles to Russia with no restrictions for their use against Ukraine as a duplicative policy against Ukraine. This appears to be Ukraine's message ahead of the Ramstein meeting. Secretary Rutte did not agree to the idea of NATO becoming involved in shooting down Russian missiles and drones over Ukraine, but he did not deny it either. Mr. Rutte, correctly in a legal sense, said that the decision to shoot down missiles was a national decision for each country and not a NATO decision. This is a peculiar stance for a continent dominated by NATO and the European Union, which prioritise collective decision-making on most policies, while deferring a decision as consequential as shooting down missiles to individual member countries. This appears to be tacit support from Mr. Rutte for the idea, but he also knows that he would not get unanimous support from NATO countries for such a policy. The issue with this tactic is that if Russia attacks the air defence sites within NATO countries that have involved themselves in the war, it would create an Article 5 response. This could potentially ensnare NATO in the conflict or breach its collective defence pledges if other NATO nations decline to assist the targeted countries. Not taking a strong position over the demand from Ukraine is a dangerous and destabilising choice by Secretary Rutte. Regarding the Ukraine Victory Plan, Mr. Rutte publicly supported Ukraine's right to use all Western-donated weapons to strike targets deep into Russia, as it deems fit. He asserted that Ukraine's right to self-defense extends beyond the border, and Russia's illegal war justifies Ukraine's use of donated weapons against targets within Russia. From a simplistic perspective of the war's politics, both Ukraine and Mr. Rutte's argument, grounded in basic fairness or the biblical eye for an eye philosophy, is valid and supports both Ukraine and Mr. Rutte's viewpoints. The problem lies in the complexity of these arguments when viewed through the prism of realpolitik, or considering all the variables involved in a conflict like the one in Ukraine. Attacks on Russia could lead to a loss of morale to support the war, and Russian capability could be degraded, which could save Ukrainian lives or cost Russia more lives on the battlefield. However, it is an escalation that could lead NATO closer to war with a nuclear-armed Russia if the casualties inflicted on Russia push the leadership to escalate or expand the war. It could speed up peace talks as the cost of the war increases on the Russians, or it could backfire and lead Russia to a decision to decide to take by force whatever is necessary and forego peace talks. The use of weapons may prolong the war by jeopardizing peace talks. Germany is one of the leading countries pushing for a negotiated end to the war. The US and Germany are also unwilling to risk an escalation with Russia by allowing deep attacks into Russia itself using their weapons. France, once a country willing to push the Russian red lines, is backing off now that domestic political issues have weakened French President Macron's ability to press for a war escalation. The use of long-range weapons on Russia, though morally right, if you can call war decisions moral, is risky, as it could just as easily backfire on the objectives and prolong the war. The question of Ukraine joining NATO was also a topic of discussion, as the new Secretary-General is an avid supporter of Ukraine joining the alliance. Mr. Rutte stated that the decision was irreversible, and as NATO countries sign bilateral agreements with Ukraine to provide aid, they are laying the groundwork for Ukraine to join NATO. Secretary Rutte's position is also problematic. NATO membership for Ukraine will definitely be a point of contention for any peace talks and will most likely be a deal-breaker for any path forward to find a way to negotiate the end of the war. NATO rules also state that a country at war or in a territorial dispute cannot be part of NATO either. Finally, democratic processes have to be respected, and Ukraine, as a wartime measure, has suspended habeas corpus and elections, including the fact that President Zelensky's term has already ended. The US, Germany, Hungary and other members of the 32-nation alliance publicly oppose Ukraine's admission. Secretary Rutte lacked the authority to discuss Ukraine's NATO membership, given his knowledge of the organization's rules prohibiting membership extensions. He is also making statements that are likely to complicate the start of peace talks, as Ukraine's NATO membership could potentially hinder peace negotiations with Russia. While offering NATO membership as a peace talk topic would be legitimate, it should not occur while the country is still at war. The open question of defending airspace over Ukraine is a national decision that appears to pose a significant risk to the alliance. At best, it could hinder peace, and at worst, it could escalate toward a war with Russia. Mr. Rutte's calls to allow free use of weapons are also a risky decision, and he was unwise to advocate on the public stage in direct contradiction to the largest NATO member, the United States, and the richest country in the European Union, Germany. The idea that Secretary-General Rutte could go to Ukraine and try to shame other NATO members to fully comply with Ukraine requests was ill-conceived, especially for a seasoned politician. We hope that Mark Rutte's mistakes stem from his new job and lack of experience in the strategic implications of military decision-making.